Hello, let's discuss namespaces. This is going to be a relatively easy lesson because namespaces don't do anything practically. They are just containers. They are just blocks to separate stuff like classes. That's it. That's pretty much all they are and what they do. So if you have anything better to do, go do that thing. If not, let's look at some details and some deeper explanations. Let's say you are trying to model two similar concepts in code, a human and a robot. Quite easy thing to do. We saw in the past lesson that you can use classes to model such objects until you realize that you created a class called hand for the human and you cannot create another class called hand for the robot because of a name conflict. How would the compiler know which one we are trying to differentiate afterwards, the humans or the robots? And no, you cannot reuse the same class because one is made of flesh and contains muscles, the other is made of metal and contains motors. And this is solved by namespaces. Like I said, they are just containers. They are blocks to separate classes, as we'll see in a moment. But first, you should know that though this is not mandatory in C#, it is considered a good practice for classes to have the same name as the files containing them, and the namespaces should have the same name as the folders they reside in. We saw namespaces before, because Visual Studio asks them automatically when you create a new class. What you don't know is that the fully qualified name, the entire address of a class, is the namespace plus the class name. So in our case, helloworld.book, which means I can have another class called book but declared in another namespace. This is the primary purpose of namespaces, to avoid conflicts. At this point there are billions of lines of code on the planet, possibly more, so at some point there ought to be two classes with the same name in the same project. Without namespaces we would have a chaos of improvisations just to try to avoid conflicts. Speaking of projects, we are just starting to work with multiple files, but we can also have directories, because you don't want to end up with 3000 files in the same location and not be able to find anything anymore. So we can add directories to group related files, and these directories can contain subdirectories to create a sort of a hierarchical structure, and they can contain classes. And now the fully qualified name of this class is hello world, the name of the project, .human.components, so the hierarchical structure of the directories, .hand, so the name of the class name, or also the name of the file. So that's why I said it is a good practice, and Visual Studio follows it, to have the same name for the class as the file name and the same name for the namespaces as the hierarchical structure of directories. And now we can add another class with the same name, and this one is helloworld.robot.components.hand, and the way to use it would be, but now I have an error. Why? Because first of all, this has to do with something that we saw in the first lesson, but I brushed it off at the time as not important. You can only directly use stuff declared in the same namespace. So if you have two things declared in different namespaces, you first need to import the other namespace in order to use stuff from it. In our case, hand is declared in helloworld.human or robot.components, and program is declared in no namespace. In this case, the compiler will put it in automatically in what's called a global namespace, but I will not talk about that. What's important is the namespace of this class is not the same as the namespace of this hand class. So that's why we need to import the other namespace first. And now hand is visible. So with this occasion we also discover what these usings do. They tell the compiler where to look for data types and stuff if it doesn't find them in the current namespace. So if it didn't find hand in the current global namespace, it also looked in this namespace, in the imported types from this namespace, and it found it there. This is easily provable by adding the other namespace too. And now we have an error, because both robot.components and human.components have a class called hand. And in this case, the compiler says the hand is ambiguous between human.components.hand and robot.components.hand. It imported both namespaces and it find the same class, the same name of the class in both namespaces. In this case, we have two options. Either we remove one of the usings and we manually fully qualify that class name like this. And in this case, the compiler can see that one namespace is imported at the top, the other is manually fully qualified. So maybe this makes it more clear that when we say using some namespace, that's a shorthand for us to not have to type it every single time. So we don't say hello world.human.components.hand every single time we want to referentiate this class. We import it once at the top with a using and it's implied ever after. So in something like this, Visual Studio is smart enough to realize that we already said using hello world.human.components. We don't need to fully qualify it again. And that's why it's graying it out to indicate that it can be safely removed. Even this one says so, simplify name. And now it's imported. The second option to remove ambiguity is to use what's called an alias. So we can assign a random name either directly to a class or to a namespace. And we use it like this. And we can either reference the human hand class and the compiler knows that it's referring to hello world.human.components.hand, or we can take a very long namespace and shorten it to a single word and use that word as if it was the real namespace. Still related to aliases, we should be using an operator called namespace alias qualifier like this, because this is the operator to access types from alias namespaces, and I do prefer it because it makes it explicit that we are importing stuff from alias namespaces, but sadly not many programmers know about it, and the fact that you can also use the dot operator doesn't make it any better. C# then also introduced the concept of file-scoped namespaces. So if I go to book.cs, I have a namespace which has a block of code delimited by the opening and closing curly brackets. And whatever types, whatever classes are between these curly brackets, so in this block of code, they belong to this namespace. Which means if I'd have two different namespaces in the same file, and each contain the same, a class with the same name, I don't have a problem because they are in different namespaces. But C#10 comes with file scope namespaces, which we can get by placing a semicolon after the namespace like this. And now you can observe that the block of code of the namespace disappeared, which means this namespace is now applied to the entire file. That's why it's called file scoped namespace, which means if I'd have two classes with the same name in the same file now, they would both have the same namespace and you'd have a conflict. But since you are not supposed to have multiple classes in the same file anyway, this is a feature that I absolutely adore, because I don't know if you noticed, but let me undo. File scope namespace removes this block of code, thus it removes the indentation. So the code goes one indentation level to the left, which means I can see more code horizontally at a single glance, which is something fantastic. Since I just mentioned that when we say using something, we instruct the compiler where to look for data types and such, when we did this in previous lessons, where did the compiler know where to look for this console thing? Because if I hover it, it says system.console. So it's a class defined in some system namespace. But I see no using system at the top. So how does the compiler know that console lives inside system? That is a setting. So if I go to right click on the project, properties, and go to global usings, I have a list of namespaces here that are automatically imported in every single file of your project. And this is toggled by this setting here. It's automatically imported. These are a list of namespaces that are most used in pretty much any project, and that's why they are automatically imported. It is a setting that is enabled ever since you create the project, and you can disable it, so you could potentially not use these implicit usings. Another way to disable or enable that is to double click on the project file and change this implicit using settings, either enable or disable. If you are wondering where these global usings are stored, because obviously they need to be stored somewhere, they are in a generated file called globalUsings.cs. Compiler generates file, complicated topic, won't go into it, but our project has no globalUsings.cs, yet we do have global usings. So you may see projects that do explicitly have it, and you can also manually add it too. Like for example, this one, where you can see that the usings are prefixed with this global keyword, which is precisely what it's intended for, to import these usings in every single file in your project. Finally, you should know that namespace usings are not recursive. So when you say something like using system.collections.generic, that doesn't mean that it automatically also imports system and system.collection namespaces. And especially for beginners, this might seem counterproductive and dumb, because I used to think that way, but it's actually not, because not knowing what else is imported and with potential conflicts and all that is not a good thing. So it's okay that it's not recursive. Anyway, I guess this was not a short lesson after all. This was all about namespaces, so enjoy, like and subscribe, and let's wait for the next lesson where we will talk about access modifiers. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tech frame.